Ja, det føler jeg at jeg gjør. Det er jo ved å se gjesten og kunne være behjelpelige. Det kan være alt ifra å besvare på spørsmål til å passe på at gjesten har det bra på alle mulige måter under hele besøket sitt. Så vi ivaretar sikkerheten på museet, og så gjennom dette skaper en trygghet for besøkende.
Ja, det føler jeg absolutt at det gjør, som en småbarnsmor. Det er at jeg kan komme inn her på museet og få oppleve kunsten og museet med barna. Og bare det at jeg får kommet inn her med vogna. Ja, skal du også si? Du også fikk komme inn med vogna, Naja?
Jeg også sier.
Ja, vi fikk komme inn her med vognen. Det var få problemer å komme inn her. Det er muligheter for å leke her og nyte å være her samtidig som barna koser seg. Jeg sto på. Yes. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this second day of our seminar, Caring for Audiences, Shifting Paradigms in Art Museums Around the World. My name is Benedikte Rønsen, and I work here as a curator of education at the National Museum, and I've been asked to give a brief introduction to today's topic. So, ready? Yes, that's a good sign. Okay, yesterday we explored the concept of care and what it can mean in a museum context. Today we will examine care in relation to a specific audience demographics, children and young people. And maybe you wonder why. Do children and young people have a greater need for care than other groups? Or is it a different kind of care that we are talking about when it comes to children and young people? While preparing this introduction, I also began to wonder whether we want children and young people to care for the museums, both today and in the future. And if so, how do we achieve that? These are some of the issues today's speakers will shed light on. Children and young people have long been a prioritized group here at the National Museum, but we are not alone in this. On the contrary, children and young people have become an increasingly important group throughout the Norwegian museum sector, especially over the past 20 to 30 years. And I believe that goes for the international as well. Concurrently, the view of children has shifted from being regarded as becomings to beings, from having value primarily as future adults to having value as who they are here and now. All the while, children and young people are as diverse as us adults. So how do we define them as a group distinct from the rest of our audience? One characteristic of this group that may matter to us as a museum is that they represent the most diverse group of visitors that we have. They visit us not only with friends and families, but also through kindergartens, schools, and higher education, groups far more varied than what we see in the rest of our audience. Another characteristic or common factor is that according to the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, they have a particular right to care. This right, which ends at age 18, includes guidance, protection, but also education, freedom of expression, and, quote, the right of the child to participate fully in cultural and artistic life, end quote. In 2021, the Convention of the Rights of the Child was the basis for Norway's first and only white paper for children and youth culture, in which children's right to care is thoroughly addressed in relation to art and culture. But as mentioned, there may be more differences than similarities within the category children and young people. So perhaps, instead of searching for common traits, on a day like this, we should ask, what is at stake? What happens if museums do not care for children and young people? As Dr. Lynch showed us yesterday, there is a significant risk that institutions like ours end up practicing a form of window dressing with underrepresented groups instead of developing practices based on solidarity. So what is at stake? Do we risk using children and young people to legitimize our museums, while they, in turn, learn that their own voice do not make a difference? And is it at all ethically defensible for publicly funded knowledge institutions like ours not to care for the next generation at a time when the world feels increasingly complex and uncertain? Many of us here today will no doubt agree that children and young people are not only a duty we must attend to, but also an enrichment for museums. Their perspective can help us lift our gaze and remind us of what museum can facilitate. Encounters with art that matter here and now, but also far into the future. I have now mentioned children and young people 16 times in 5 minutes, so I think we are ready to jump into today's program. Thank you so much for being here, and enjoy.
Thank you, Benedikte, for this lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone, for yesterday's success. I look forward to continue today with an exciting and meaningful program. And with that, let us begin by welcoming our first keynote speaker, Mark Miller. Mark Miller is the former director of Tate Learning, where he led the learning strategy across Tate's 4 galleries. As a cultural producer, consultant, and artist, his work bridges art, education, and cultural engagement. His artistic practice explores connection between rural Jamaican and urban British experiences through multidisciplinary assemblages of drawing, sound, and moving image. Please join me in welcoming Mark Miller and his keynote, Defining and Redefining Positions.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thanks, Adrian, for that wonderful introduction. Really pleased to be here, National Gallery. Thanks for the invitation, and hopefully I can contribute to all the wonderful thoughts, topics, and points made yesterday in a meaningful way. I'm going to sort of cover really sort of broad questions and a bit of sort of thinking around museums and galleries and the current context that we find ourselves in. I would say that my work has predominantly been with young people. I'd say in terms of my career at Tate, I'd say probably 2/3 to 3/4 of it has been around the sort of the impact, the access, the diversification of audiences surrounding young people. And in the last 4 years I've been director and sort of senior management. But the reason why I say that is because my sort of thoughts are going to be much broader. But obviously my main focus has been young people, so hold that in your mind as I speak. You're going to see a series of images, and a lot of them are images of projects that I've done and led over the years, over many years. And many of them focused, as I say, on young people, different formats, audiences, focused, and intergenerational audiences as well. I was going to say a little bit about my sort of current role, but I think Adrian did a fantastic job, so I'm not going to say that much more about that. I'd say that at the heart of this work, the ambitions, the possibilities, and the multitude of communities and publics that I've worked with over the years and organizations have always utilized care in its broadest sense. Care for rigor, care for practices and processes that we engage in, care for the role of well-being, and I know that's kind of a mixture of two pieces, but I think there is something about the care of how we look at well-being, consider well-being, considerations of the past and present narratives and thinking, and I think the communication around intellectual care, also the obvious pieces around the collections and archives within museums and the canon, etc. And of course, political and social care. And interestingly, we find ourselves in a space where, you know, the rise of populism, racism, decolonizing practices really brings me to ask the question is like, what should we all really care about? I think at this moment in a juncture, as cultural workers, as artists. I think especially if we think about Maslow's hierarchy of need, as well as Roger Hart's ladder of participation, and especially thinking about young people in this context. I just wanted to sort of go back to a bit of the sort of foundational work through learning. I suppose in my former role, I have always viewed museum programs as active, generative, multidisciplinary, creative learning spaces, and really about embracing the power, if you want, of art, people, to learn, to inspire, to realize, to acknowledge our collective potential. And I really believe that creative learning as a form of empowerment, especially with young people, through the divergence and the growth and cultivation. Creative learning has been framed as this sort of open-ended space, you know, for adaptability, for improvement, for experimentation, for critical thinking, for moving from passive to active participation. I also feel that there is a real importance in terms of the definitions between creative learning, learning and education. Learning being a much more porous, open-ended approach around acquiring knowledge through experience, whereas education is much more instructive. And I think it's important to make those distinctions. I think in the work that we do, especially around creativity, art, culture, access, diversification of audiences, etc. This idea of creativity is rooted in the generation of ideas, finding solutions, criticality, imaginative thinking and rethinking. And I think my current title as artist, cultural producer, consultant really has enabled me to reflect a lot on the purpose and my role and a lot of these questions surrounding creative learning and the positionality of the museums and galleries. I think, as mentioned, my work is really looking at these interconnections, both across my, if you want, my lived experience, but also the social and cultural context that surround me. This idea of the sort of consultancy and cultural production is also really considering what are the spaces within the work that we do within museums and the work that my intersect as artists and my experience over the years is really considering how this role can play a really direct and responsive engagement with where we are in terms of the context of museums and the work that we're approaching and doing at the moment. There is really, at the moment, I think, over the last 5 years, the emergence of care. And I know, and I feel that, a lot of stuff that was said yesterday, there will be some repetition as well. And I think some really important points were made, and a lot of the points, I think, that Benedikte made around care, the word care. And I would say over the last 5 years, maybe a bit longer, but care has been cemented itself purposefully, I think, in many ways, in the shift in the ways that we work, and a lot of that was due to the global pandemic. But then we moved to this kind of global awakening space in terms of, and I think a lot of this was driven by young activists, the murder of George Floyd, for example, this global awakening around race, discrimination, and equity. And then we moved into this space of the so-called culture wars. And then now we sort of find ourselves in a space of populism. And these social, cultural, economic shifts have really enabled care to continue to be foregrounded, both in what we do, how we theorize, how we present, and what we think about as cultural organizations. I think the word care has been used now more than ever. I'd say perhaps overused. Practices of care, care riders, as well as the broader connections around sort of emotional labor, well-being, microaggressions. There's so many terms that have come through in the last 5 to 6 years. For example, the effects of predominantly white institutions on black and brown people, the range of gender identities, the requirement to understand and enable support for many participants who work with us, a spectrum of platforms within the museum context as well. And one of the questions I've been asking are whether practices of mutual empathy could be a phrase or a definition that we begin to think about, which is, could this be a much more shared and relevant term? Should we utilize empathy or the lack of it to enable decision-making surrounding care? Could we use this as a useful mechanism to reflect on approaches to practices of care? I also wondered if care has lost its meaning, because we also considered, and we should also consider the realities of this work, skills required, capacity, training needed to care in the professional context. Some of the realities of the work, I think I have an example, which is a program we do or did called Queer and Now. Queer and Now was a project which highlighted queer programming through the collection at Tate Britain in London. Queer and Now celebrated the powerful role of LGBTQI+A communities and their contribution to art and society. The format was a festival style, running over 2 days, workshops, films, performance. You can imagine the sort of scale. I'm sure many of us do programs like that, very multidisciplinary, aiming to reach 6,000 people over 2 days, open to all audiences. Now, the complexity of this was that internally, there were sort of 9 internal departments directly involved. So that means programs like library and archive, young people's programs, early years and families, volunteers, design, etc. You can sort of imagine. And then outside of that, externally, there's sort of around 50 external partners, artists, contributors. So you can imagine the scale and the complexity of this. I mean, organizations such as Queer Circle, Gendered Intelligence, many more across the piece. And I think what this really brought to the fore was that our teams approached it in a really authentic and rigorous way, I think, and looking at how we could support and care for those audiences as well as the communities, and how this strong, ambitious program really wants to focus on these communities. The ability to cover the breadth and the complexity and the capacity required for the work, especially as a public institution, brought through major challenges. I think for the team, who are a relatively small team within Tate, and that rippled across the organization. I think many of us who work in larger organizations, as well as small, you understand the sort of ripple of the impact of both capacity, of anything related to reputational damage, bureaucracy, you know, how our team, staff, knowledge, awareness, systems, processes. So it's also crucial that we manage expectation, especially in this context, and what care can be delivered and at what level, as well as what care actually means to those multitude of artists, partners, individuals, program contributors, especially. And I think some of the learning there was just this, just the scale of the idea that we care and want to care for a vast range of audiences, and the complexity that each individual artist or each individual organization, as well as their expectations of what that care really meant to them. Also understanding the frequencies, and I don't mean frequency as in how many, I mean frequency as in sound waves, as in kind of, you know, the vibe, the atmosphere, in terms of what can be delivered with quality in specific contexts, specific audiences, as well as how these methods of care manifest themselves in terms of these individual groups and their perceptions and the impact on organizational capacity and reputation. Many organizations, I'm sure including this one and many others, have strong processes of care, if we compare that to perhaps 10 to 15 years ago. This support, training, championing well-being, self-care, as well as platforms around cultural support, signposting, guidance, etc. But still, there's many questions remain about, are we really set up in 2025 to care and for the future? I think as individuals, artists, cultural workers, researchers, colleagues, you know, we're all really unified, I think, in appreciating the requirement for care, both for each other, but also for our sort of external partners and relationships. I think this sort of navigation and maneuvering around the multitude of expectations that we have, both in terms of patronage, audience, staff, supporters, understanding when we can speak and when we need to be silent. Organizations are often asked to make statements, especially large organizations, publicly funded organizations, are often asked to make to make statements at contentious political and cultural moments. But there are the positionality question, you know, of organizations always happens at these really contentious moments. and the requirement for inclusion in these multi-layered relationships around governance, around statutory role of organizations, and a range of representational expectations. And the question is, what sort of language within the context of care can be used to be direct or to be subtle or to include, actually, and also to push back. So we also need to think of and find ways to define communication, organization, how we communicate our organization in a much more heterogeneous way rather than a homogeneous way. There are so many complexities in the life of cultural organizations made up of really diverse individuals that hold the parallels of our daily sort of considerations, life and sort of decision making. And in many ways, this idea of redefining and thinking about where we are, how we position ourselves, I think we really need to embrace and share and communicate the critical questions that we are asking ourselves within the cultural organizations and asking the surrounding audience and participants. How we sort of move, I think we hold a sort of deficit space when it comes to engagement around young people, around broader audiences, around diversification. And in many ways, we need to. I feel we need to shift away from that and start to think about the multi-layered complexity, the answers that we can unravel questions, that we are unraveling questions, that we do have a multitude of priorities and stakeholders who want very different things from organizations, which require real care and balance. I think, as mentioned, sort of governance, curatorial, artistic, acquisitions, statutory requirements, the focus around content and how we make decisions around that, as well as policy, politics, and positionality. And as we sort of in a section around young people, one of the most important things, inspiring as well, and also enables vulnerability, I think, as a sort of, as if you want an older person working with young people, is the sort of, they see authenticity like that. Anything you do, whatever you're creating, young people always understand quite quickly and instantly whether this is true, whether it's honest, whether it's tokenism. And I think if we think about where we want to be as organizations, young people, as said before, play a key role in this, both in terms of where we are in the future, but I think as future audiences and all the obvious things we say. But I do think that piece around authenticity and their instant reaction to that is really important for us as organizations to really feed for and feed into and feed from. So this thing around understanding behind the scenes, our workings out, are crucial for us to communicate as organizations. And perhaps this is the next phase in what we do. And I know this question has been around for a long time, in terms of the vulnerability of organizations, but we still haven't moved really anywhere with it. But I think that working out the process, the building, the trust, and yesterday was mentioned the idea of how we build trust with organizations, and I think that's also a big part of this. The same, where are we? Where am I? Yeah, the same questions keep emerging. I think for decades, many of us who worked in museums and galleries for many years, we could see the same questions emerging, but there's still not many answers. We all know the answers, but there's no sort of space to move, such as, how do we connect with our audiences? Still there. How do we reach a more diverse audience? Still here. How do we maintain our core audience? Still here, which I think we do all right. What are we willing to stop? You know, that's been something. What are we willing to give up? That's still there. The question is, and also, I'm not sure how much this is, but we used to ask this at Tate. Do we really want to change is perhaps the question that we should all ask. Do we all? Because we're still kind of... take that back. So much progress has been made. I don't want to sort of say that. I think comparing where we are now as both as individuals within the context of museum space, and perhaps that's the paradigm shift for me, is the sort of the cultural awareness, the audience-centric nature in which we find ourselves now. So many of us are thinking much more about audiences and the nuance and the techniques and the complexities of that, which is really present, you know. So these questions, and the key question I think we need to ask is sort of what is it that we need to enable us to break the cycle to progressive action? Because I'm sure these questions were probably here before I even started working in museums and galleries as well. Being outside of the museum, only for like 6 months or so, but has illuminated even more sort of how little audiences, partners, stakeholders know about the what, the why, the how museums and galleries exist and operate, you know? So I think this space around how we communicate our techniques and our texture and the movement of our spaces is super important. I need to do the next one. Sorry. Whoops. And I've witnessed the language and the policies and the shifts, you know, from multiculturalism to diversity to protected characteristics and equality to inclusion and equity is kind of where we are now, you know. And all of this really illuminates the cyclical nature in which this work exists, this kind of reoccurrence, you know, of the same questions or similar challenges still come round and round and round. Institutions, and I think some of the definitions possibly are institutional vulnerability and demystified practices, practices of mutual empathy, which I mentioned earlier, symbolic gestures of care, points of authentic reciprocity with audiences to enable participation and connection with the work that we do within museums. Recently I was involved in a talk at Somerset House in London, part of the 154 Fair. While doing this, it made me think about this idea of terrestrial communities, a terrestrial approach. And I wondered whether this could be taken or a suggestion, or even this just as a space to kind of open up where we are to think more broadly, sort of. And this is a proposition by Dr. Achille Bembe, which is this concept around terrestrial habitation. And this also references Dr. Malcolm Ferdinand, who has written a book on decolonial ecology, thinking from the Caribbean world, and the work of an artist, Monica de Miranda, which was called Earthworks. And these three sort of collide because the works really consider this idea of decolonial ecological approach, how we refrain from a colonial approach of hierarchy and extraction, and consider how we acknowledge a shared responsibility of the earth as a shared space for human and non-human species, to really rebalance how we consider the land. So I just wanted to end on just thinking, could we take a terrestrial habitat approach to a care ecosystem in thinking about the cultural organizations and the work that we work with young people and our broader audiences? And I'll just stop there. Denise.
Thank you, Mark, for this important presentation.
Yeah.
We now have some time for questions. So as yesterday, just raise your hand and we will give you the microphone.
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
I want, like, you have spent an immense amount of time, as far as I see and I know, coming into introducing yourself to these communities, building relationships, building trust, breaking trust, maybe sometimes. I kind of think like, I'm a practical person and I'd like to, if you were talking to the younger Mark, like 20 years ago, what would you say to him? What would be your advice to your younger self in relation, of course, you can give any advice, but in terms of this work, like going back and thinking, like, what would you do differently?
Working in a museum?
Yes.
That's a really good question. I don't know.
Or like working with the communities. Like,
yeah.
Things. Thank you.
I would say, you know what, I would say really sort of, I wish I'd done it earlier, really sort of unpicked the systems and processes of which I was sort of talking about of the museum. So you understand the sort of how far you can push things. I mean, I always worked in stealth anyway, and I think within learning departments you kind of have a bit more space to maneuver, let's say. But I would suggest to any young, let's say, cultural worker, is to really unpick and understand how organizations work, institutions work. You know, governance structures, bureaucracy, the sort of systems, the processes, the rhythms of the organization. And then you can maneuver earlier and you get less upset, I think, you know, because I think there are certain expectations of how far the organization can be pushed, as well as what the role of the organization is in your life, you know. And I think generationally there's sort of different expectations from what an organization or an institution does or can do for you. And I think getting that early to really understand that, not as a limiter, but almost as something that you can sort of expand your practice of change, if that's what you want to do, you know. And I think also be really honest with yourself as to why you're actually in that institution. And if you're talking about organizational change, diversification of audiences, engaging young people, then, you know, that's where you need to really be authentic with yourself about what you want to do in that, because I think as young cultural workers, sometimes you think you can do more change than that is actually available to you. I think there's something about understanding what change is available to you at any one point in your career. I think it's touching my stubble. But and I think understanding that is super important, you know? Like how are you gonna set a time frame around your change? And I don't mean it as it's much more organic than that. And I'm not really a sort of future person, but I knew why I was at Tate. And I knew what my sort of ambitions were. So I'd say to sort of lay that out quite early and be realistic about it as well, you know? Hence the sort of understanding the organization piece a bit, you know?
Thanks, Mark. I mean, I think similarly, I think you're in a very fascinating position, having had 18 years at the Tate and now stepping outside of an institution, but also as you and I were talking about yesterday, the Tate has been in a very particular position in the UK because it's been in the eye of the storm. Yeah. Almost every social or political issue that's in the zeitgeist has played out publicly at the Tate, which in a lot of ways has been really useful, but not very easy for those on the inside. But I'm again thinking about working with young people, and I'm wondering, the word that's cropped up in my head this morning is careful. Are we too careful?
Careful.
Yeah. And are we, as organizations, enormously careful? And so when you're working with young people, that's a really difficult position to be in, because as you're explaining it, is that right, that the organization and its workings isn't going to move the way these young people want to see movement or want to see change or want to be able to express whatever it is that they bring to it. So I guess my question for you is to ask you, has care been useful as a concept for you in your work with young people? Has that been a useful concept or even a conscious concept in your work with young people?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I would say it hasn't been conscious. I'd say most people, I sort of come from main background, trained in visual arts, etc. But however, I did a lot of youth work before coming to Tate. And I think the question, as you say, Benedikte, I think there is a subconscious or subliminal, maybe, perhaps, space around care, whereas I think people spoke about sort of instrumentalizing care in a sense. And maybe it's half-half, 50-50. I think it's kind of useful for a sort of broader cultural awareness around care. I think it's not so useful around trying to limit care in a way. You know, I think we try to expand it, but in a way it sort of limits it because we start to all think about care potentially in a very narrow sense and in a very organizational sense and in a very bureaucratic sense. You know, and I think, you know, we go back to sort of box ticking, whether it's around audiences and care. So I think it's 50-50. I think it's been useful to acknowledge and feel perhaps a bit more comfortable around the space of care and knowing what you might do if someone has certain requirements, needs, in terms of abilities, neurodiversity, protected characteristics. So it's useful in that sense, but in some ways it's sort of taken away the sort of tacit sort of learning and nature perhaps that, you know, I found when I was doing the early days of sort of youth work, you know, with young people who are facing a lot of challenges and stuff. Yeah, but I think it's a really interesting question about the usefulness. And I think as we were chatting yesterday, I think, like you say, in terms of the challenges that Tate has faced, or the being in the eye of the storm, to use your words, Benedikte, had, for me, like massive learning, you know? And I think, back to your point, I think we shouldn't be too careful, you know? And I think that's part of what I'm trying to say as well around this kind of, just kind of trying to expose ourselves, you know, a bit. And I think that will go a long way in breaking down some of the spaces, barriers, etc., you know? And I know it's difficult, you know, I've been in the eye of the storm, I know how it goes, but I think as a critical mass, you know, there needs to kind of be some shifts. Maybe that's not it, but...
Thank you. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
we have
Okay.
not so much time, so if you have a short question. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I'm sorry.
So, well, I don't know if it's short. I really liked your expression of the processes of mutual empathy, kind of maybe taking away a little bit the problems when using the notion of care, and also this closeness between care and maybe, I don't know if it's the right word in English, but assault, almost. Or what? How do you say that in English? Yeah. Assault, yeah. So sometimes I don't need your care, maybe, and it feels like an assault. And also getting back to the pity you were talking about yesterday, Bernadette. Don't pity me, or don't think you know my story. Or so there's something about, of course, this notion of care that can easily be very negative as well. So I liked this notion, but then again, getting back to your question about can institutions care, because then we have kind of getting back into the fact who are really meeting our public, and it's so relational, it's so dependent on building up relations, and who are the staff doing it, and maybe we should just be content with the fact that, like Nora Sternfeld talking about all the things happening when the adults are going home. So maybe it's okay that it's kind of living in these parasites around the museum, and just maybe we should just accept that we can't do it as the big institutions. Or what do you think? Maybe that's the way to live with it a little bit. Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I feel and think. That perhaps you have a philosophical, conceptual framework around care as an organisation, but actually. And that's the sort of, we shouldn't go at it in a sort of homogenous way and like label an institution like, you know, the care of the National Gallery or the National Museum. It's like, how can you do that, you know? So I suppose it's just like this breaking apart, if you want, of the organisation as a sort of, as a conceptual framework, but actually beneath that is the sort of terrestrial habitation piece, which is like how it's broken up individually and what are the responsibilities of different parts of the organisation, different individuals within the organisation. But the idea that an institution can care doesn't really make practical sense. I think in a sort of communication sense it may feel all right, but I don't know anyway, but yeah. Better stop there, time's up. Got big red signs in there.
Thank you, Mark.
Right.
Big applause for Mark.
Thanks. Cheers.
It's time for a break, a short one. So be back here at 11:25.
Ja, absolutt. Det er helt sikkert. Det åpenbare er jo helse, miljø og sikkerhet. Vi skal sørge for at publikum kan være trygt på utstillinger. Det neste, og for så vidt også åpenbare, er at publikum skal ha en god opplevelse med å være her. Vi skal sørge for at museet er et bra sted å besøke. Og at de får en kunstopplevelse med den kunsten som er, uten at noe av det vi holder på med rundt forstyrrer den kunstopplevelsen, tenker jeg.
I arbeidet mitt som kurator så er jo selve begrepet tuftet på care, det er curare, så det ligger jo det i omsorg for verkene, og også publikum. Når jeg jobber på Nasjonalmuseet så er jo det en av grunnene til at jeg jobber her, nettopp for å jobbe med publikum og kanskje vise care, eller omsorg for de. Og hva det betyr kan jo diskuteres. Jeg beveger meg i hvert fall i begrepet omsorg litt bort ifra en sånn omfavnende omsorg, men heller omsorg for å forstå publikum. Og det føler jeg at vi jobber mye med for å få innsikt i hva og hvem publikum er, og hva de er interessert i, hvordan livene deres er. For det er ikke nødvendigvis at det matcher mitt liv, og den omsorgen jeg tror jeg trenger, er kanskje ikke den omsorgen publikum trenger.
Welcome back, everyone. We now move into a session that brings together 4 case studies from across the Nordic region, exploring how art museums work with young audiences, families, and communities. To guide us through this session, I'm delighted to introduce Abdirahmaan Hasan. Abdirahmaan Hasan is a 20-year-old and studies applied computer technology at Oslo Met. But behind the study titles hides a poet, creative soul, and self-proclaimed culture kid. He has been active in the field of art and culture since he joined the Youth Council of Fotogalleriet through the keys to the city as a 17-year-old, and has since worked with several institutions in the city of Oslo. Please join me in welcoming Abdirahmaan Hasan.
Oh, wow, that's a lot of people. Good day, everyone. Again, my name is Abdirahmaan Hasan. And before we start, I want to say something important first, before we go to our special speakers. I know some of you were thinking maybe, how did this young person end up on this stage, this international conference, this very fancy conference? Was it my very deep academic background, my short but very deep art experience, or maybe because I'm the youngest in the building? No, because I figured out the truth why the National Museum invited me. And I was invited because my name starts with the letter A, which is first on the list. So it had... So it has absolutely nothing to do with other things, you know. No, pure alphabet. But maybe also a tiny bit because I'm young and multicultural. And we love diversity when it matches the program. I'm joking. Mostly. I'm aware that I'm 20, and the panelists today also, for example, are in the 35 to the 50 age range. So if I look extra respectful on the stage today, it's because I'm trying to be one with the adults, you know. Anyways, jokes aside, I'm really happy to be here, and today we have 4 brilliant speakers. I'm very excited to pick their brains and talk about the themes they're going to talk about today. So our first speaker today is Mette. She's an associate professor at the Center for Youth Research at Aalborg University, which is in Denmark. And she works with one of the most important questions in art right now, which is again, like, how do young people participate in art, culture, and what gets in their way as well. And her research digs into, youth agency, marginalization, and the method we use to actually understand how these people have their experiences. And she is also sharing insight from major study across 5 Danish art museums, and looking at how these young people meet art, but by not just viewing it, but also creating and collaborating it. And transforming these museum spaces into their own spaces. And she'll also walk us through this model that shows also how young people encounter artworks and how these two sides interact. And she'll highlight also not just the hopes these encounters create, but also the actions they call for. So thank you. Give a warm applause to Mette.
Is this the right position? Yes. I could initiate the same way with my age, because I just said to Nana down there, can I even read the letters here? I turned 50 years this year. You know what will await you. So first of all, thank you for the invitation to the National Museum. Thank you for gathering voices and insights from different parts of the world. It's an opportunity for all of us who are present here and online to identify new tendencies and relationships between museums and audiences. But it is also an opportunity to explore the multiple tensions with these new trends or new tendencies and the infrastructures surrounding them. I also want to thank you for inviting me as a youth researcher into your space. In my research, I focus on young people and their formal and informal engagements in art, culture, and community life, and the hopes and dreams, but also the dilemmas these engagements contain for them and from their perspective. In the presentation, I will share insights from a recent study. It's a comparative study where 5 Danish art museums designed encounters to support social sustainability and well-being among young people. I will present some of the core findings and finish by attending to the actions these encounters call for if art museums are to become sites for a production of imagined elsewheres in young people's lives. As a youth researcher, I will start by zooming out a bit and look across broader tendencies in contemporary youth life to set the framework within which these encounters fit. Youth research has pointed out how, on the one hand, young people's lives increasingly are destabilized by acceleration, changeability, and unpredictability. On the other hand, how systems surrounding them have created a normative ideal that rewards efficiency, linearity, and purposefulness. And how this cross-pressure that many young people experience very strongly and not surprisingly have difficulty handling is an important component in a worldwide increase in the number of young people with mental distress and diagnosis. Accordingly, youth research has discussed a new pattern in young people's lack of well-being, where young people from the broader middle class who did not grow up in homes with poverty and exclusion are facing problems in an educational system and wider youth life where concepts of normality appears increasingly narrow. In different studies, youth researchers have pointed out a pattern of vulnerability where new forms are being added to old, more classical forms of, and vulnerability thus takes on a more complex character. In this figure that we're seeing up here by Nielsen et al., it is represented as a democratization of vulnerability in numbers and who is being hit. But, and that's very important, at the same time a polarization where new forms merge with older, more classical forms of vulnerability and intensify the gap between young people who thrive and those who severely struggle with lack of well-being in today's society. It is a new pattern that youth research suggests calls for new approaches in how we work to support social sustainability and well-being among and across very different groups of young people, as we have also seen in the different presentations at this conference. The comparative study I'm here to present is based on qualitative empirical data from 5 longer-term encounters between art museums and different groups of young people. The 5 encounters had different duration, different group size. It also meant that the professional who engaged in these encounters worked with them in different time spans. Some engaged with them for a year, full-time almost. Other professionals were just in and out in more brief periods of time. There were also different partners involved, ranging from elementary schools to more specialized youth education and a social program. The young people who participated were therefore also very different. Some were in the transition between childhood and youth life, while others were at the other extreme of youth life in the transition into adulthood. Some of the young people struggled with both social and mental health problems and had difficult educational experiences, while others belonged to a broader group where lack of well-being is something that more momentarily affects everyday life. The study intentionally positioned itself away from dominating at-risk discourses, whereby young people are seen as either lacking resources and agency or as someone whose resources and agencies are going in the wrong direction. Instead, it asked how art museums can become sites that support young people's well-being, understood broadly as their possibility to live more livable lives, defined with the words of Judith Butler, as living life with the assumption that one's life has value, a value beyond market value, and that the world will be structured to facilitate one's flourishing, and that this happens or will happen not only for oneself, but for everyone else as well. Based on this broad, and you could almost in these days say utopic definition of well-being, we used what the sociologist Paulson and Tilly have called the black box approach to explore the mechanisms, the core elements that young people valued as making a difference to them in the encounters with the art museums, and in what way and to what extent these elements can be understood as contributing to their well-being and social sustainability. The study's first finding might be obvious, but nevertheless it constitutes a map for the findings. We have mainly collected our data at the museums, but when you talk to young people and take an interest in their perspectives, it also becomes clear that what they experience and do at the museums never take place in a vacuum, but interacts with what they experience and do in their lives in general. The study showed that the encounters at the museums were integrated in the world that the young people are part of, and that both their participation and the outcome of these encounters cannot be seen in isolation from this. This is the first, you could say, evident point of the study. To illustrate it, we developed a circle model that shows the elements and arenas that, when viewed from the perspective of young people, work and interact in the encounters at the museums. In the following, I will present insights into 3 mechanisms within this model, 3 significant elements that young people pointed out as making a difference in their thrive for social sustainability and well-being across the encounters in the study. The first significant element that the young people valued was that the encounters insisted on a genuine interest in their perspectives on the museum's artwork. It happened in ways that opened up for ambiguity, nuances, and art angles, but also for mutual qualification through the interactions that the young people had with the artworks, with each other, and through questions and reflections that the professionals brought in when they took their perspectives on the artworks in new directions. Here, a young woman explains how a lot of different views in the artwork unfolded and how these multiple perspectives from her peers made her reflect on it and see it in a different way. However, the study pointed out that the encounters activated very different kinds of discursive repertoires, thus emphasizing that young people's perspectives are always shaped in different directions that invite certain kinds of reflections, ideas, imaginaries, and understandings to unfold. The second element the young people valued was how the encounters all involved both the museum's artwork and the young people's own productions of smaller and larger works. In all the encounters in the study, the young people were introduced to selected artworks and took part in some kind of experimental artistic process where they acquired new techniques, engaged with materials, and gained experience in producing finished works in different formats. The encounters were structured so that the artworks and the productions of the young people's own works mutually influenced each other. On the one hand, the encounters with the museum's artworks contributed with themes, approaches, forms of expressions, and food for thought, which the young people could then bring into play in their production of their own works, where they combined and unfolded them in new ways. On the other hand, their own productions functioned as a process where they continued their reflections on the artworks they had encountered and developed new understandings of them. Here a young man explains how this approach was new and surprising to him, and how he had never imagined that he would be making all sorts of things at the museum, things that he and his peers would bring back and exhibit, in this case, in the school's hallway. In the interviews, the young people shared how there was a systematic effort to ensure that the meetings with the artworks and the young people's own productions mutually enriched each other. However, the interaction between them appeared differently and in the different encounters. In some encounters, they were closely interwoven in time and space. For example, when the young people worked with their productions in the exhibition room in front of the artwork, while they, in other encounters, were more divided in time and space, and here the productions took place in the museum's workshops and even through long hours of engagement at the partner institution or in the young people's own homes. The third element the young people valued was how the encounters with the artworks and their own productions constituted a multitude of little publics where they shared perspectives, gained inspiration, and appeared differently to themselves, to others within the groups, or to a broader audience. At the same time, there were major differences in how the little publics unfolded in these 5 different encounters in the study. You can almost draw a scale. At one end of the scale, the young people engaged in little publics around small exercises where they could try on different things. This type of little publics were often associated with fun and coziness, but occasionally the little publics at this end of the scale came across as irrelevant to or detached from the significant arenas in the lives of young people. These publics risked to lose relevance after some time if young people did not experience that they were able to connect them to other significant parts of their lives in meaningful ways. At the other end of the scale, young people engaged in little publics that intervened more radically in their lives and identity processes. Here, young people were taking on tasks and reflections that they associated with bringing something new and important into the world, which were often characterized by containing great significance to them. In one case, young people gained access to present their own productions at a reception at the museum for their family, friends, and broader network, and their work was made accessible for the audience at the art museum afterwards. In the study, the little publics were mainly located at different places on a scale between these 2 extreme positions. Looking at the encounters in relation to social sustainability and well-being in young people's lives, the study pointed out a range of different potentials. I'd like to touch upon a few of them before finishing the presentation with some of the tensions and dilemmas the study also revealed. Firstly, the study showed that the kinds of encounters we just heard about can make art museums accessible and meaningful to young people in ways they have not experienced before. In the study, this counted for young people who did not see the art museums as relevant, as well as for young people who already had a relationship with them. Here, a young woman explains how the encounter, in her case, changed her idea of the art museum as a place that is rigid, intimidating, limiting, and difficult to decode. Instead, it became a place of joy and exploration where she gained a new sense of belonging and looked forward to return to. I just want to make sure I'm on the right. Okay, sorry. I have to tick very hard on this one. Secondly, the study showed that these kinds of encounters can open a crack in what British educational researcher Caroline Jackson defined as fear of failure cultures that many of the young people struggled with in their school and social lives. During the encounters with the artworks, they were encouraged to deal with both large and complicated questions. When their own perspectives on these questions were brought into play in ways that emphasized ambiguity and created dialogue, and where they shared preferences and interpretations with each other, as we saw in the former example, young people experienced being able to qualify each other's perspectives, but also that there were no right and wrong answers. A young woman explained it this way: no matter what you actually said, it wasn't wrong. So you could say your opinion and what you think about a picture or the artist's work. And it wasn't because it was wrong. There are just many perspectives. By emphasizing ambiguity and many possible answers, the encounters pushed those fear of failure cultures that for some of the young people dominated parts of their lives and established a new and more curious and joyful culture for the group while at the museum. Thirdly, the study showed that the encounters contained a kind of transformative power where some of the young people experienced to flourish in ways that also transgressed the museum side. They talked about being present and focusing on what they were doing while at the museum, and about subsequently having more energy and strength to step back into the spaces they came from and be present there in other ways than was usually the case. Here is an example of how the encounters with the art museums took hold and opened up the young people's everyday life in new ways. In the quote, they share how they felt like they had energy for something else when they came home from the museum. You're ready to do more, as they explained. We can laugh about that, but I think that's very thought-provoking that they mostly come home from school without that sense. The study, as small as it is, also showed that for some of the young people, the encounters with the art museum contained a transformative power through which they confronted a fundamental experience of being encapsulated by the mistakes, shortcomings, and difficult issues so often defining their lives. For a few of them, the encounters with the art museum simply gave hope for more radical changes in their life situation. Here a young man shares how you suddenly see opportunities when you get out and do something like that, and especially when it's a place like the museum. It feels legit. Sometimes there is not a lot at stake when young people become in charge and take action and experience the encounters as a source of transformation of themselves and their lives. For some young people, this was an overwhelming process, and it therefore required great commitment and care from the art museum as well as the partner institutions involved. As we heard you say, Benedikte Lynch, when you quoted a woman yesterday, it is difficult suddenly to be heard. However, the study also somewhat painfully pointed out that most of the young people seldom imagined the encounters with the art museum to give way to social sustainability or well-being in their lives. Here a young girl quickly dismisses its potential to make any difference in her school life that she imagined will remain much the same, as she emphasizes in this quote. It points out the well-known dilemmas and tensions of project regimes in engaging with the infrastructures that could permit these kinds of encounters to become sites for imagined elsewheres in young people's lives. The study thus argues that well-developed encounters with artworks and own productions can create a place in the art museum for young people to flourish with what they are and experiment with whom to become. But also that these encounters are limited when young people try to imagine how they can flourish through them elsewhere in their lives. Summing up the study, we asked how art museums from a young people's perspective can become sites that support social sustainability and well-being in young people's lives. To avoid an at-risk discourse, we applied Judith Butler's broader approach to well-being as young people's possibilities to live more livable lives and letting them put value to what that could mean. The title of the presentation, Art Museums as Sites for Imagined Elsewheres in Youth Lives, however, alludes to yet another theorist that we have already touched upon a few times at this conference, namely Donna Haraway. In Haraway's thinking, humans are not alone. We come into being by virtue of and with other humans and non-humans in processes of becoming. Actions, as well as the changes they can lead to emerge in complex, dynamic, and responsive encounters in a lived here and now. However, this lived here and now can also, but not always, constitute an imagined elsewhere, a hope for a different and more social sustainable life and world, so to say. We could also say that staying with the trouble, as we have quoted her for at this conference a few times, thus also means to care for creating a presence that can constitute actions of change in a future. Behind the title of the presentation, thus lies an insistence on taking seriously how art museums can give form to a present from where another future can gain its contours when working with social sustainability and well-being in young people's lives. I suggest this to be not only an act of care, but also maybe an act of resistance towards the spirits of a time of high speed and acceleration, whereas sociologist Carmen Leccardi has pointed out, the future has a tendency to be burned up and fold back into the present, absorbed within it, and consumed before it can really be conceived. Understood this way, and in the context of this conference, caring might be about insisting upon the possibilities to constitute a present from where imagined elsewheres, in the sense of the hope for better futures, not only for the individual young person herself or himself, but for all others, can arise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mette Nielsen. The next speaker we will have is Carin Hedberg, and she's a senior curator in education here at the National Museum. And I hope she gets double paid because, you know, it's here and she works here as well. But all in seriousness, her research focuses on something called object-related mediation and drawing as a sensory and practical method and deeply rooted in something called phenomenology. And she leads a practice-based research project, What Can We Learn from Art-Based Education? And beyond her curatorial work, she's also a visual artist, working in socially engaged art, especially with material-based practices. And that is very nice. Her perspective brings together care on also young people's embodied experiences of art. Asking how museum spaces can take care of children, and not only intellectually, but through what they touch, what they build, and what they create. So, thank you, and please give a warm welcome to Carin Hedberg.
Thank you, Abdi. Yeah. Thank you very much. I am invited because I have an A in my name, so that's why. I have been asked to present an internal case from the National Museum's collection with a focus on children and care. And I will share my reflections by reading my text in the form of an essay. The case explores how we think about children, materials, and care in museum praxis. I argue that art-based learning can open doors to bodily, sensory, and relational forms of participation in processes that in turn contribute to a sense of care for visitors, for the museum itself. With this in mind, let us step into the collection display. 10,000 square meters with around 6,500 works spread across 2 floors. Here our education curators, many of them artists, have developed drawing rooms, philosophical cards, and physical engagement activities integrated in benches, as I will mention as hands-on activities. In more than 30 exhibition rooms, so it's huge. So I have the privilege of being part of this team. And over the past 2 years, I have been working, as you mentioned, Abdi, on an internal practice-based research, exploring what we can learn from art-based mediation. And the project is carried out in collaboration with my external advisor, Mette Hermansson-Jonvik from the University of Stavanger, and colleagues in the museum. In our inquiry, we had prioritized listen to multiple perspectives, including those of security staff, hosts, curators, conservators, and visitors. We have also considered the artwork themselves and the hands-on activities and the atmosphere of the room, as well as factors such as light, sound, and institutional practices. The method is drawn from data such as observation, interviews, and conversations. In parallel, I have also conducted a study together with Professor Palmyra Perrault at the University of Oslo, focusing on the digital tool SEAS, from which some of the results present here are drawn. In this study, we recorded 1,410 visitors and conducted 54 interviews with families across 5 exhibition rooms. I have chosen to make this presentation minimally visual as a deliberate contrast to the highly visual world I am describing. I will show you 3 short films, 1 minute each, but before we look more closer at how these hands-on activities are used, I will start with the art itself so that you can form an inner image. The exhibition room is rectangular with 3 doors, 18 paintings, and 1 sculpture. Those are displayed in the gallery space. The titles describe color use, such as house with a red roof or the blue kitchen. The colors are bleeding and the figures have green skins and yellow noses. In one painting, ultramarine dominates, spreading out from the center. A vivid green hue frames the blue, while the sky carries a faint violet tone, with blue formations reminiscent of clouds. At the center, a large black sailboat and several smaller boats seems to merge with the blue. In the foreground, a figure struggles to pull a cart,
followed by a running dog, a red patch in the middle of the composition bleeding into the surrounding blue. The hands-on activities relate directly to the art in the gallery. They are unique, no two are exactly alike. In one of the rooms we will soon visit, loose wooden blocks of different colors and shapes are embedded in the bench, inviting free association with the expressive paintings. A black oval, a red patch, a green circle, a blue square. Elements that can be combined in new formations. A few days ago, I walked through the exhibition with the family you saw before. The two small children were just 1 and 3 years old, visiting the museum for the very first time with the mother. In the film, we will see how the children grasp, lift, push, and explore.
Den der. Den skal være kåpa. Den første. Den skal være siden den. Perfekt. Det skal være en stor. Så skal den her være rett og slett. Skal den være der, og den være der.
Nå ja. Har du sett at den henger fast her? Se. Se.
Den.
Ja, se. Skjønte du det?
Går den også? Mamma.
Ja.
Ja.
I will take a closer look at the concept of material, art-based learning, and family, and explore how these notions are closely interwoven with each other, and with the concept of care in a museum context, or in this context. Before moving into the National Museum where we are now in 2022, it was common for the educators to bring plaster, marble, or bronze objects stored in the net into the gallery space as an entry point for discussions about sculptures with school children. The children could touch and sense the material, making them an active part of the interpretation. In this example, material served an instrumental function with the logic in which the significance of material is tied to learning. During my research period, I have had several formative discussions with my advisor, and together we have sought to push the concept of interpretation towards something more entangled, where humans and materials are in continuous entanglement, mutually shaping one another. In new materials theory, materials are not passive but co-creative. They participate in relational networks with people, spaces, and ideas, and this challenges traditional art pedagogical models in which the visitor is the subject and the material the object. In mediation, material can function as tools to illustrate or activate art. From a new materialist perspective, materials are co-creators of meaning. They possess a form of agency. This requires us to listen to materials and to the responses they evoke. In the museum, this means that mediation or interpretation is not only about how to talk about art, but about activating relationships between art, visitor materials, and space. Philosopher Bruno Latour might ask, what do things do to us? Not only what do we do to them, and who decides what material should do in interpretation, and can material be caring? We will now proceed to the next exhibition gallery. The room feels bright. White walls evoke the modernist white cube, and we have entered a new era. The absence of a clear figure or a landscape in the artwork opens possibilities for new ways of thinking. 10 abstract sculptures are placed on plinths, while paintings and textiles hang side by side on the wall. The hands-on activities in this room is made of corian, a material reminiscent of ceramic or marble. It was created in collaboration with the artist Are Mokkelbost, and he described the work like this. The object was developed with the atmosphere of the room in mind, without a direct, readable connection. It consists of a standing framework of 3 metal rods, onto which flat cutouts are threaded, each able to rotate independently. There is no front or back. Rather, the design invites all positions to create one or more visual connections, and the play revolves around an associative puzzle without a single definitive solution. The objects listen to the room, to the sculptures, the paintings, the textiles, the visitors, the light, or even a security guard passing by.
Oi, så kult. Og så det sånne
Kan vi være
hull.
We call the method art-based learning. In 2021, the National Museum formulated an internal document defining what we as an institution means by art-based learning. In Norwegian, kunstbasert formidling. Art-based learning referred to some form of artist-led or artist-initiated interpretation that draws on artistic experience, strategies, processes, and techniques within the situation. It is not only about who initiates mediation, it's also about what happens within the network of artists, educators, visitors, material, space, and institutions. Understood through Latour's concept, art-based learning is a practice in which all these elements participate as equal actors. The hands-on activities are not merely pedagogical tools, they are create connections between visitor and artworks, between sensing and reflection. They are not passive, they co-create meaning. But the use of objects in gallery remains a subject of ongoing discussion, particularly regarding safety, but also concerning visual competitions with art in the exhibition room and sound, of course, of children playing. Hands-on activities challenge established norms of security and conservation and raise questions about where they belong within the museum system. My investigations indicate that activities in the exhibition space can have a positive impact on protecting the artwork and addressing conservation concerns. When visitors are allowed to touch and explore these objects, the tendency to touch artwork decreases. In that sense, the objects have caring and regulating agents with the space. This kind of caring challenges established norms and compels in the institution to reconsider its priorities. The target group for these initiatives is families, visitors who choose to explore the museum independently rather than a part of a school group or guided tour. In this context, family is understood broadly, recognizing the many ways people connect and experience the museum together. When we speak about children in the museum, I acknowledge that children are individuals, yet what I describe here concerns universal human traits. The Norwegian philosopher Sigurd Verven argued that children are often excluded from philosophical reflections on what it means to be a human. He takes the children's perspective seriously to gain new insights. Children are curious, they try things out. How does it feel? How does it taste? What sound does it make? And young children ask by doing. They touch, taste, smell, stroke, hug, throw, bang, listen, sniff, and feel. And for them, touch is essential in exploring the world. Childhood constitute a quarter of life, and when we consider how pivotal childhood is for who we become as adults, it appears as life's most important phase. As we heard before from Benedikte, according to the United Nations, every child has the right to engage in play and recreational activities and to freely participate in the cultural life and the arts. This means that artistic activities and play are not luxuries or add-ons. They are fundamental rights that must be protected and promoted by the state and society. The significance of play has gained increased attention in recent years. Research shows that rising mental health challenges among children and young people are partly linked to the deficit of free play. But while play has instrumental benefits as learning social interaction, fostering creativities, confidence, cognitive and emotional skills, it's equally important to also recognize play for its intrinsic value, independent of utility. Play and art are something in themselves. In the National Museum's current temporary exhibition, Art Handwork in the Light Hall, there are two large spaces for practical interaction, one for drawing and one for weaving. Art-based mediation in the exhibition has gained recognition, and visitors expect it and ask for it in the National Museum. And it's interesting that interviews reveal that even those who do not actively participate perceive the museum as creative, inspiring, and inclusive, quality closely aligned with the notion of care. The last gallery we will visit features landscape painting that capture the Nordic light, a pink sky, crisp white snow, and a forest lake reflecting the sky. On the bench are transparent color plates in cool and warm tones, along with fragments of paintings. And children don't always do what we might expect. In the film, you can see them experimenting by holding the plates in front of their eyes, transforming the atmosphere of the entire room.
Det är blått.
Og den der, da?
Oi. Og den
Ser du noe?
er det den her. Sånn. Nei. Er det lyseblå? Ja. Oi.
Finally, I like to underline, if we take care seriously, it cannot remain a decorative word in our mission statements. It must be reshaped, the entire ecosystem of the museum. Care is about rethinking institutional practices, policies, and priorities. It means creating conditions where meaning emerge through entangled relationships between artworks, materials, visitor, and the institution. When we allow touch, play, and curiosity to coexist with conservation, security, and organizational norms, we move from mediation as transmission to mediation as interaction and co-creation. In that shift, care becomes a shared and collective responsibility, an institutional value that embraces both human and non-human. Perhaps it is within this entangled state that the museum can find its most caring form, where everything has its place and value, not as an addition, but as a part of its core. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. We're running out of time, so I'll make this quick. But this next person is all the way from Iceland, Ragnheiður Vignisdóttir, and she is the head of education and publishing at the National Gallery of Iceland. She holds a degree in art history and cultural mediation, plus a master as well, and she's been shaping museum education both locally and internationally for over a decade. She is also a published author of museum learning materials and also serves as a secretary on the board of ISOM Iceland. And her work also consistently asks, how do we make museum spaces more of relevance, dialogue, and belonging, and especially, again, for younger audiences. So today she brings her experience from large-scale educational projects that bridge classrooms to museums, and expanding on visual literacy and empowering children and teachers to use art as a tool for learning. So give a warm welcome to Ragnheiður Vignisdóttir.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me here today. It's been inspiring to participate in this conference for the past 2 days. My name is Ragnheiður, and I'm head of education at the National Gallery of Iceland. And in this role, I oversee, among other things, our educational work, mediation, and publication. When creating framework around our projects, care for our audiences is central to our work, prompting us to ask questions such as how do people connect to art, how do they learn through it, how can the museum be a space of relevance, dialogue, and belonging. I'm here today to present a project called The Power of Vision that started at the National Gallery of Iceland in 2021. The project revolves around visual literacy training through the museum's collection and is now bringing schools and museums in Iceland closer together. It started as an informal discussion over the museum's way of mediation during a coffee break among a few staff members. This shows how a simple discussion among museum professionals can lead to a paradigm shift. In short, the conversation was about how visual culture affects almost every part of life now, yet very little time is devoted to teaching visual literacy in the Icelandic schools. We asked, could the National Gallery help teachers bring visual literacy into the classroom using the artworks from the museum collection? From there, the project started to develop based on a collaboration between the museum, curators, school teachers, and students, where this informal idea became a structured, practice-based research project. The project was grounded in an ambition to bridge the gap between the school system and the museum, to share the museum's collection and promote visual literacy with all the benefit that comes with it: knowledge of art, critical thinking, vocabulary, and conceptual understanding, while also positioning the museum as both a site of learning and a meaningful, relevant destination for teachers and students. One of the most important decisions was to treat this project strategically at the institutional level and not as a side project. That investment of time, staff, and resources changed the scale and nature of what we could do. As the project partnership took shape, we recognized that teachers needed something tangible, something they could bring into the classroom and use directly. In response, we developed educational material, sjónarafl, þjálfun í myndlæsi, with the English word for that is power of vision, visual literacy training. And it was written by the Museum Educational Department in cooperation with teachers. The publication connects art and visual literacy to the national curriculum, providing discussion methods, prompts, and activities to foster critical thinking, empathy, and dialogue. The reception was very positive. The book sold out its first print run, and the reprint is now underway. And teachers across Iceland are using it to integrate art into everyday learning. This book certainly opened a door, but sustained connections required relationships. Alongside the publication, we developed a teacher training workshops at the museum. In these workshops, educators come to the gallery, experience the space as a learning environment, and practice using visual art as a tool for dialogue. Out of that emerged a teachers' club, a growing community of educators linked to the museum. Members are invited to special events, discussions, and exclusive courses, and they share experiences and remain in active contact. Through this network, the museum has shifted from a one-way provider of content to a two-way partner in learning and reflection. With the sjónarafl project, the museum is a place to learn through art. Before starting, we questioned traditional methods of mediation. The typical guided tour, for example, guiding through dozens of artworks in 1 hour with the educator talking the whole time and a little space for dialogue. In our visual literacy program, we focus on 1 or 2 artwork per visit. Students engage in dialogue using a question-based method. Through this, they not only learn about art, but also how to ask questions themselves, turning these questions into keys for understanding and, most importantly, enjoying art. Also, instead of the speed and overstimulation of modern life, we offer time, focus, and shared attention. This shift is central, providing a space for connection, slowed down observation, and shared meaning. Over time, what began as a modest initiative evolved into a project with national impact, influencing how students and teachers engage with visual art. And here is something I want to underline. Today, visual power, or sjónarafl, is being taught at the University of Iceland's Faculty of Education, shaping how future teachers think about art and visual literacy. And this is a reminder of how a small idea can grow to have a lasting social impact. In 2024, the National Gallery of Iceland was nominated for the Icelandic Educational Awards, presented it by the President for Sjónarafl. The award recognized the project's contribution to strengthening collaboration between institutions, acknowledging how it bridges the gap between schools and the museum. More important than the recognition itself is what it represents, the relationships built across institutions, with teachers, schools throughout Iceland, and students who now engage more confidently with visual culture. Other museums in Iceland have now adopted the project with their own collections, showing that this model can be applied in virtually any museum context. From a conversation over coffee to a structured research project to a publication and a community of educators, this shows that caring for audiences is not a one-off initiative. It's an ongoing practice of listening, responding, and evolving. Thank you. I only use half of my time, I think. But
Thank you so much, Ragnheiður. We really appreciate it. Okay, our last but not least speaker is Tove Sørvåg. She's a concept developer learning at Munch, which is right here. And she's also the curator behind the exhibition series, Come Think With Us. And her work also explores, what participation really means in children's encounters with contemporary art. She plays a key role in also developing Munch's diversity and education and research programs. And Tove also holds both 2 masters in art history and curatorial practice. At this point, that should be a PhD. And she has been shaping learning at Munch since 2015, which is a decade. And her presentation dives into how museum spaces, can become places where children not only think, but also think with art, with curators, with artists, and with each other. So thank you, and please give a warm welcome to Tove Sørvåg.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that nice introduction. And thank you all for being here. Today, I'm going to just give you a brief introduction to the Come Think With Us series and share my reflections on, especially on participation, but also, I would say, collaboration. And as you all know, this kind of presentation format isn't enough to show you the grand and spectacularness of the artworks, so you have to imagine something beyond the screen. So what is Come Think With Us? It's a series of exhibitions that's been happening since 2022, in the making since 2019. This is an attempt to describe what it is, starting from the title. Come is an invitation to someone outside the museum. We want to bring in external voices. Think marks that this is a space for research, where new theories can arise. With refers to a participatory aspect, where several people involved signal to us. It is a collaboration. And in these projects, we work with artists who have an interest in children as audience groups. They might not have that much experience, but they're interested in them, and who also sees both collaborative and participatory strategies as part of their practice. We work mainly with children aged 3 to 12 and the adults that they bring with them. And before I try to answer my own question, what does with do? I thought I would give you a brief description of the different exhibitions. And I have to say, a few months ago, it seemed like a good idea to ask myself a question. Today, I'm not so sure, but I will try my best. The first exhibition was The Brain Maze by Jenny Bringaker. It was a huge winding maze made out of crumpled up cardboard and craft paper, inviting people to draw, to play games, and just explore. It was important to the artist to highlight the possibilities of process, to showcase that it's not important the finished object, isn't necessarily the important bit, but the value and joy of being in a sketch-like processual state of mind. And since this was the first project, we were unprepared of the amount of people who visited it and the kind of excitement that it created. I was also very unaware of the amount of markers that were needed to fill these exhibitions. But what happened after its initial run, it was decided that it should be moved to a different floor and reopened in like a second iteration. And I have to say that that was one of the biggest privileges to ever have, being able to take all the insights, all the knowledge, all the experiences that we gathered from the first iteration and putting them into creating that 2.0 version. And I remember thinking, this is such a privilege, it will never happen again, so I have to enjoy it, and I really did. The second exhibition was The Chamber of Chaos by Fredrik Floen. It was this dramatic, theatrical space where you had like textile objects and costumes, encouraging the audience to build, to dismantle, to play, to dress up, to maybe go in dialogue with each other. And in the beginning, we thought a lot about this being like an analog Minecraft space, a space for world building, for creating your own fairy tales, narratives, stories, using your whole body when engaging with the art. And as the artists come from theater, scenography and choreography was quite important. We used lights and music to create these different scenes almost. Watching how when we went from like bright lights to pitch dark, what happens with the way the audience interact. If you have like a medieval kind of troubadour soundscape, what happens then with the games they play? And what happens when it gets very like soft and more like mellow. And the third exhibition was Sophie's Room by artists Rosa and Ronak Mushtagi, where the key was to use different magnetic shapes and create their own images on the walls, but also contributing to these huge like communal murals. And it was very interesting to see how children and adults both kind of started building their own images and kind of deciding when is it okay to steal from another picture, when can I build on it. So seeing how they kind of collaborated with people that wasn't there anymore was very interesting. The artists in this project came from the dance world, and they especially wanted to explore how social choreography can shape our aesthetic experiences. How does the way different people move, the colors they bring with them, with the clothes they wear, and the way they kind of navigate the space, how does this create different forms of aesthetic experiences? And also you can see there's this box in the middle. This is a fountain. It was a huge victory for us to be able to bring running water inside an exhibition space. And this fountain, it acted almost as a dancer, creating these movements that also we saw that the audience responded to. The fourth and last exhibition this far is You Are What You Is by Kiyoshi Yamamoto, where the antagonist of the exhibition was this monumental textile work, meters on meters with hand-painted Brazilian silk, moving to the music of composer Hermeto Pascoal, almost like a textile performance piece, inviting audiences to move with it, but also sometimes betraying them, challenging them, putting the audience in the role of the protagonist. And another participatory work in this exhibition was the Fitas do Bonfim, which were a series of ribbons, and you could decide if you wanted to take one down or tie one up. But we never put any instructions there. We wanted to see what happens if it's just there. How do people react? What do they do? And we saw that it was very intuitive what they wanted to do, and it followed this like larger trend almost. They saw what other people did, and they did the same. This is just to show you how the work is when it's opened. This was a furniture / mountain to climb on / space for different viewpoints. And we also wanted to see what happens when we take the art outside of the exhibition space, and it's the first thing that meets people. So trying to give a kind of short summary of the core characteristics in the Come Think With Us series. I'm going to go into detail on the first two, so I thought I would just linger on this third one, which is creating a different museum space. So in these exhibitions, we want to challenge the norms and rules of the white cube. You know, a space where you have to be quiet, you have to move softly, you have to know a lot before you walk in, you have to be familiar with all the references, and you have to kind of contain yourself a little bit. We wanted to show that this is one way of being, but we also have different spaces. And we wanted to create exhibition spaces where you could be yourself, speak loudly, take up space. So the first is something I have called intuitive participation. It's a term that I've made up, but it was very important for me to have this working with the series, because when we talk about, I think we've also kind of touched upon it earlier today and yesterday, this fashion or this habit we have of filling or using words without filling them with meaning. And participation for me is kind of that word. It can mean everything and nothing. And it's also very easy as a museum to say, well, it's participation, and then you look like a good museum. But are you actually just inviting children to be like unpaid extras in your own performance? So I think it's very, very important to specify which kind of participation we want to invite into. So I went to learning, where you have like intuitive learning, and created this term. And what I want to say with it is that it's about not having a participation that creates some kind of measurable knowledge, but highlighting how your own competences, your inherent knowledges, experiences, is everything you need to go and interact and kind of be part of the artwork. And it also encourages a very active kind of participation, because you have to use your body to be part of it. In Come Think With Us, we have quite an exploratory nerve to everything. I think it's also interesting that a lot of us have named this the practice-based research. I think that's very familiar for many of us working in mediation. And this is a model inspired by Emily Pringle's work. And it shows how we have worked both on the series as a whole, in each different exhibition, and also in each different phase of the exhibitions. This thought of having a question, experimenting, trying to create some kind of knowledge, insights, anything, and that, again, then creates new questions, and then new experimentations, and then, so it goes in this like infinite loop, right? And for me, this model has been very important, especially when we go into like full production mode, and everyone else just is like, okay, we have an opening, this is the road, let's just cruise on down, and then remind ourselves, well, no, this is experimentation. We have to take risks. It might not work. We might, maybe it won't be as good as we wanted it, or it will be something different, but it's very important that we keep this experimental space, I think, for these kind of projects. And so I told you that I made up a term, and this is where I started. These models are classics when we talk about participation. It's the Arnstein's ladder from 1969 of degrees of citizen participation. And then you have, in 1992, Hart kind of developed on it, creating another specific ladder for children's participation. And they differ slightly, but what they have in common is that they start with, like, on the lowest steps, you have, like, non-participation. In the middles, you have partial participation. And at the top steps, you have, like, full, genuine participation. And in the beginning, we wanted to reach the top steps, I think. But we have never managed to do that. We've always landed somewhere in the middle on consultation, consulted and informed. And thinking backwards, I have to say that I think that that's the right steps for us to be in at this point, because I don't think the museum is ready to, in an ethical way, invite children into democratic decision-making. And also, I question if art is where we should have democratic decision-making. I don't know, for me as an adult, I don't necessarily want to decide what art is. The reason why I love art is because it surprises me. It gives me something I haven't thought about before. And if I think that, I think maybe that also children think that. So I think it's just... So what I wanted to show you with showing these ladders is that it's not about being like the best participatory actor, but it's about being very, very transparent and clear on what you are inviting people into. And that we always did that. We always have, when we did like qualitative interviews with children during a production process, we said to them, so this is an artist, they are working with this and this project, we want to open an exhibition, we're wondering about these kind of participatory or engaging things. Now we want to hear your reflections and opinions about these things. We may not change what we're doing, but we want to know what you think. And I think that's, for me, it felt very, I never felt like I was fooling anyone, which I think was important. And as I said, practice-based research is at the core of this. It's part of how Munch works with practice-based research. And that's very central to how we develop all our mediation projects. And it also links back to the model I just showed you, right? About how research can be something that you do. It's something that you create, and it's value in doing, being with people, being in spaces, not just of like solo thinking, but talking and creating. So trying to give you a summary of some of the key learnings we have gathered this far, I think it's important to say that play and intuitive participation matters. We see that when children are invited into these spaces, they gain a confidence interacting with contemporary art that they might not get other spaces. And also very important for me to say behaviors and perceptions differ. What may seem as unconstructive, chaotic behavior to adults actually can be a space of growth to children. And we have these, when we did some of the interviews we did, we asked adults, like, what are you seeing? And they were like, oh, it's chaos, something bad is going to happen soon. And then when we talked to children, they described a feeling of relaxation, of just kind of liberation, recharging. And also, very importantly, none of the children we talked with wanted all the exhibitions in the museum to be like this. Many of them talked about how being in these spaces made them more prepared or made them enjoy the more traditional exhibitions. They were able to kind of go and look at like paintings on a wall, and then they could come to this space and have a different aesthetic experience. And I would say co-creation, because now we talked a lot about children as participators in these projects. We haven't co-created with them. That's also very important for me to just make very clear. But we have co-created with artists. All the artists we have worked with have themselves described these projects as collaborations between the museum and the artists. And working with artists in this way is very, very valuable for the museum, but it also demands a lot of care. We have to be very, very serious about the care we provide for the artists we're working with. Because they're very generous. All the artists we have been working with have been very, very generous. They've trusted us. They've let us in very vulnerable parts of their artistic practice. And it's our responsibility to make sure that we hold that space for them. That we make sure that they are also able to be professional artists. This isn't instrumental. This isn't a play spaces. This is art. And that's important that we take care securing. And like this has had quite a huge impact. We have high visiting numbers in these exhibitions, around 150,000, 175,000 per exhibition. So that's quite large numbers. And we see that when we just do like observational studies, we see that the audience is more diverse than in our other exhibitions. And I think that it's one tool of many for the museum to create a more inclusive space. I wouldn't say that this is the only way to do it, but it's one of many. So trying to answer my own question, what does with do? I think with shifts our focus. We move from what we can do alone to what we can achieve together, both with children and with artists. With not only makes visiting the museum more engaging for our audiences, but it also makes it more inspiring for us who works in museums. It builds knowledge in the museum, it strengthens partnerships, and it opens up new ways of working. I would say, in short, with turns exhibitions into living processes, not just finished products. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tove. We have come to my favorite part, where we grill the participants. I'll be asking them questions today. Right now, it will take some 20 minutes. I know we have lunch, so I will not promise, but maybe promise to not go that much over time. But I want to maybe call upon the people first. So, Mette Nielsen, could you please come to the stage and give a warm applause, people? Come on. Yes, thank you. Not this one, though. This one is mine. This one is mine. This one, yeah. Yeah, this one. This is mine, yep. Then we have Carin Hedberg. Could you please come on stage? Welcome. And then we have Ragnheiður Vignisdóttir from Iceland. Good. And then last but not least, Tove Sørvåg. And then we also get some water, so we're hydrated, which is very important. So guys, this is maybe different from teams, right? It is amazingly how fast the time can go. But I want to ask a maybe personal question first. Because, you know, all of you, you know, touched something deeply in me, because I started thinking about, you know, these experiences I had with museums when I was growing up. And there was maybe one museum that was like the first experience for me, where I actually did something interactive and I was very intuitive, and that was a technical museum. And I know it has a lot of games, it has, but it also was like the first museum where you know, could touch stuff, where you could do stuff, and I know how much that also engages children and youth, so that's very important that you guys talk about. But I wanted to ask you, what is maybe one moment with the young people you have worked with or seen or had at your museums that has stayed with you? Yeah, there's a lot of thinking here. So please take your time.
I have an answer.
Yeah,
okay.
Let's go. Good.
For me, it was in one of the interview sections we did prior to opening one of the exhibitions, where I had this like nagging fear: is this art or is this just a play space? which was this like, I wanted to be sure that I knew what I was doing. And then we asked a child, like, can you describe how this differs from or is similar to a play space or a playground? And the child answered, was like, well, you know, in the playground, I kind of know what I'm supposed to do. I've done it before. I know kind of what is the right thing to do. But in this space, I don't know, so I have to use my imagination. And for me, that gives me so much joy because I love being imaginative and using my imagination. And that was just a reminder for me that, yes, this is something we're doing. We're allowing people to use their imagination. I think that's very important.
And there are no right and wrong answers. Yeah.
Should we all answer this question?
Yeah.
So you asked me this. I knew about this question, and I've been thinking about it
this
whole morning, and I can't put down just one thing, but I've been thinking about all the little moments, all the sparks in the little eyes and the wow moments that we get a lot in our job. But also for me, it's when we see that the museum becomes a haven for children who has never visited the museum before. But when they do, and when they come regularly through maybe a program that we provide or an exhibition, you see that they get more comfortable, and the museum opens up and becomes a space where they belong, and that's important. So I can't pin down one like you did, but there's so many small moments that we have. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. I haven't prepared an answer. No,
okay,
I haven't prepared an answer, but I have a memory. And I had a group of kindergarten, small children in the gallery space, and we were sitting in front of a very famous Norwegian artist, Harald Solberg, Vinternatt I Ronderna. It's a painting. It's a blue painting, really a blue painting with the mountains and blue sky. And I asked them, what do you see in the picture? And what kind of colors do you see in the picture? And everyone didn't answer blue. That was maybe the most obvious. So they answered yellow and maybe black and green. And I had really to get deeper into the painting and look at the painting and find all of those
different perspectives.
Yeah. And I think it's a quite good picture of how is it to work in a museum. So yeah, that's my experience.
Good answer.
Is it on?
Yeah, it is on, Anna. Yeah.
I spent the last 10 years with young people outside museums in more sort of informal arenas of art production, what Butler would call the undercommons, you could say. And I was very touched by one of the last quotes in my presentation, where this young man who comes from the undercommons and enter the museum, and what he says afterwards, is how important it was for him because this was a legitimate space. And what I want to share with you is that this young man spent a lot of time with what we could call bedroom practices, art practices on a very high level that never came anywhere else but on his own computer. He's a composer. And what he shared with us in this interview, and I didn't know because I've met him a few times before I did this interview with him in relationship with the museum. And I realized in this interview that he had never finished anything.
Wow.
He said, I had tens of thousands of works on my computer that I had been working on for the last 10 years, but I have never finished any, and I had never shared it with anyone. And what he was invited to do was to sort of do an audio walk. So what he talks about, the museum as a legitimate space actually also pushed him to take the risk of finishing something and sharing it with others, which was very, very difficult for him to do, but it moved him on in a way I haven't seen on many of the arenas I have been following and that I have a great respect to. But it really touched me, the power of museums in that sense. So that was what came into mind.
Good answer. All good answers. Like they heard about the question today, and maybe you already thought about this, you know. But I want to also ask, because I think you all dwell in the same themes. So in a very short manner, because we're running out of time, how do you understand participation?
We want another question.
Okay, I might not be answering your question directly.
Okay, yeah. It's an open-ended
I've been
question.
thinking a lot about the caring and programs for young people, and what we've seen just for the last 10 years that museums are doing more of than before, that they're inviting children and young people to have fun in the museum. And that's so important, to have fun. Even if it's I remember when I was 10 years old, I went to a museum with my school and it was the longest hour of my life.
Right.
But just having fun, doing something and creating something and it's created by professionals with certain means but having fun in museums.
Yeah.
It matters. We all love to have fun.
I can attest to that, yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't maybe answer your question. I was inspired by your presentation. So.
Yeah, I think we should think of participation as a broad spectrum of things.
Yeah.
All of us here today are participating in something.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I think participation is so many different things, but you always have to know what kind of participation you choose and why you do it.
Okay. Anything to add?
Anything to add? Yes, I think since I talk about objects and material in my presentation, I would maybe also add that when we talk about participation, it's often about relationships and between people, but it's also, in my opinion, also about all the material and all the artworks in an exhibition, for instance, and to make those relations between even not human existence. And that's in my Latour think. I think having those participational relationships between even objects and material that make me think about participation in another way.
Yeah, and I could join you by saying that participation is much more than just one thing. It's about joy. It's about the possibility to make a change in meaningful ways in your life. It's a possibility to appear differently to yourself and to others. And it's about, when we talk about children and young people, it's about gaining access to places and knowledge that we as adults are the gatekeepers of. So also about gaining access to resources and places that children and young people do not have access to by themselves. Yeah.
That was a good answer too. All good answers. Like, it's as if they're researchers. They are, but I have to go to the end. So this is maybe also a hard question as well. What are like one of the barriers stopping museums from embracing young audiences today?
Can I start? I don't know your world very well, but I was very touched. Mark, where are you? I had the feeling that some of the infrastructures you faced were some of the barriers. I think, just to share the last example very briefly, it took hours and hours from the learning department to legitimize this young person's participation. Hours, efforts. I think you have probably done quite a lot of those struggles for one person to be legitimized.
By the time.
So I think that's probably one of the barriers, the extreme time-consuming and effort it demands to legitimize young people and children in the museum. So thanks for, I was very inspired by that in your presentation.
I think maybe one barrier can be understanding if we see it as just audience development, like raising numbers, taking nice photos that we can show, collecting money, or if we're really, really interested and curious in what children and young people can contribute to the museum. I think that's the barrier. If we go in the audience development way, I think maybe, as you said, like they see when it's fake. Yeah.
Yeah, we can go to the next question. I don't mind. Should we go to the next question? Okay. Yeah, I decide we go next. What do you guys hope? This has to be very short, like a sentence. What do you hope young people take away from these encounters?
That this is a common where they can be part. That they can be part of.
That they know that.
And they experience it.
I mean, and they have to feel like they are part of decisions and that we take them serious and it's not them and we. And yeah, shortly, very briefly.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with both of you that it's a place of relevance for them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Place of relevance.
Mm-hmm.
A genuine experience that art is for them.
Mm-hmm.
The genuine experience. Also good, all good answers.
Yeah.
You guys are very good at your job. And then last question. What do you guys hope the audience takes from your projects? I mean, it's a conference. They're here to learn.
Should I start?
Yeah.
I hope that they want to create huge, big, enormous projects in their institutions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think sharing is caring, and the project that I was presenting today is something that can be adopted to any museum. So just contact the National Gallery and let's do a teaching material if there's an.
Hopefully experimenting, try out things, accept to fail, and not everything is perfect, but we have to try out, be brave.
Be brave.
I hope you will think about the future, the present not just as a contained present, but as always giving way to futures, and that is especially important when you work with young people, because they are in a transition in their life, and so I think the future is an important aspect of the present that you create, and that it contains futures. It always contains futures.
I hope you guys took notes. And with that, thank you guys for sharing your insight and passion for the young audiences. Thank you everyone here for listening. And if there's one thing we should always take away, about talking about these young audiences, that young people aren't just like the future audience. You're not preparing for the future only. They are the right now audience. They're in your rooms, in your spaces at this moment. And they deserve spaces that listen, care, and also create with them. So thank you so much today, and have a good lunch.
Thank you to all of you for your presentations and playful panel debate. Before we go to lunch, I have some practical information for you. And that is that your wristband, you can use it as an entry ticket to the museum. So do that if you want to. You can go to the ticket desk and they will give you a ticket for if you show your band. And also, you cannot bring your jackets and your bags inside the museum. So if you want to leave your jackets and your bags before we go into the workshops, that would be very good. And I also want you to go to your phone and figure out which workshop you are attending, so it will go smoothly when we are dividing us into groups. And lastly, the meeting point for all of you that are going to Vigeland Museum after the workshops are here outside of Storsalen. And now it's time for lunch.